Hello, friends. This is Cassandra Joan Butler along with you, and I'm coming to you somewhere in the universe, and I want to talk to you about something that's affecting all of our universes and our communities across the globe. I would like to offer a little astrological research regarding the coronavirus and hopefully give you some information, some history, and yes, some hope. So let's first of all talk about what's happened today. On February 27th, the stock market took its largest jump, largest drop in history, almost 1,200 points. And they're saying this is in direct response to the fears concerning the coronavirus. Of course, this got me going, and I thought I want to do some research and see what is this about? Are there any parameters we can take a look at from other pandemics from an astrological point of view? So that's my intent for you today, to do a little bit of information about the coronavirus. COVID-19 is its official name. And I want to emphasize that all the information I am quoting here is coming from either the CDC, the Centers of Disease Control, or the World Health Organization. And then, of course, the astrological analysis is my own, but mundane astrology, which is basically the study of trends and cycles, is steeped in a very wonderful history, because for those of you new to astrology, and I like to do these webinars with the idea that you don't have to understand the intricacies of astrology, but just remember one thing in particular. Astrology is based on cycles, and we have what we call transpersonal or outer planets. The longer the orbit of these outer planets, such as Pluto, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, because they're so far from the sun, the longer their orbits, the more profound the mundane effects on society, not just personally. It's a fascinating study. And so for those of you who are piqued a little interest in astrology, I would recommend a book right out of the get-go with looking at societal changes is Cosmos and Psyche by Dr. Richard Tarnas. Even though it's very much a reference textbook, it will talk about the different cycles using the larger cycles. So that's what we're going to be talking a lot about today. All right, so my first reaction, I'm sure if you are astrologically well-versed, you too, this coronavirus outbreak, it's still, as of February 27th, an outbreak, an epidemic. It's not a pandemic yet. It has something to do with the lineup in January of Saturn and Pluto, and the other planets too, by the way, along with the nodes. So when we are looking at larger cycles, we look at the larger, more powerful planets coming together. And so in January, we had Saturn, which is depicted here by the Hermit card, the isolating energy of limits, discipline, focus, individuality, and yes, sometimes death, and Pluto, which represents transformation and yes, death. So you might be able to say here that Dr. Death was with Grumpy Old Man together in the sky in January 12th of 2020, heralding a new beginning, a new cycle in the sign of Capricorn. Now, Capricorn is the energy in astrology which represents structure. And I mean structure, like the structure of big banks, big governments, big monopolies, everything that has a hierarchy attached to it and power and control attached to it at the same time. So the fallout of the early part of 2020 is uniquely wrapped around the concept of fear. The fear that others, something outside myself, is going to control me. So what I've been saying to a lot of my clients and other webinars and so forth, feel the fear, but walk through it anyway. Create your own authority, create your own lineup within your own faith and faithfulness within yourself, because the external structures may very well be letting you down. So this is what began 2020. This is even before we really were well versed or conversationalist with the coronavirus. However, we first knew about this way back when, on December 8th of 2019, hence why it's called COVID-19, when the first outbreak occurred. Then the World Health Organization recognized that there was the first death from the virus, which occurred in China, and it happened right before this lineup, within just 48 hours. You can see here in the chart, there's Saturn, depicted by the grumpy old man, along with Dr. Death at 22 degrees of Capricorn. And so when this chart, this is the first documented death of the virus, right? So we're going to call this the starting gate. On that day, we had Jupiter conjunct the South Node. Now in astrology, this line is kind of like the spine of a chart. This is called the nodal axis. Nodes of the moon represent turning points in consciousness for everyone, and they're depicted visually by eclipses. We did actually have an eclipse on January 10th. And so when you have an eclipse, so the day of the eclipse was the first time that this death was being reported to the world. And what was also happening with that Jupiter is the planet that has to do with expansion, on top of the karmic point or south node of limitation. Now, how many astrologers read a south node? I think we all can agree the south node depicts that sign in more of its shadow side, more of its negativity. So the negative part of a structure is fear, power, and control. That would be the negative side of Capricorn, as it were. So Jupiter was expanding that point, expanding fear when the first death was being announced. So here you have it. These are two other depictions of Saturn, Father Time, it also represents time, and Pluto, which represents death but transformation. Just like when a volcano erupts, it leaves the cooling lava in its wake and the landscape is totally changed. But there's a lot of fiery death of all around, the rocks all around, and the topography around an erupting volcano. So again, these two visuals are depicting Pluto and Saturn together. So traditionally astrologers say when this happens, we don't have epidemics or pandemics. And that's in all of many different astrologers' research. But we often represent a fear of lost time or an overthrow of the existing social order. So this might be playing into what we're experiencing now, but this in and of itself is not creating, historically from an astrological point of view, a pandemic, because what we basically need, I'm going to flip to this one. This is the missing link, Neptune, my friends. Neptune in astrology is the planet of illusion. It represents disease, viruses, bacteria. Neptune is the veil. And so Neptune is not actively in an aspect, or an astrological aspect, which might be difficult with this particular timetable at all. In fact, just approximately a week ago, on the 20th of February, Neptune was making a very auspicious or harmonious aspect to Jupiter. So I think that the Neptune-Jupiter sextile is actually a message, as it were, from the cosmos of having faith and having a sense of optimism in the face of this very difficult worldwide crisis. As of, again, February 27th, it's not considered a pandemic. We'll talk about that. So Neptune is the missing link. And let's go back So this is with the official word on January 30th. That's when the World Health Organization announced and declared the outbreak a public health emergency. I'm really mincing words here, but I think this is important to know the difference between an outbreak, an epidemic, or a pandemic. And there are levels of criteria that the scientists use to determine these different levels of difficulty. So when this official word came out, and I want you to really take a look at this date, it was on January 30th. Today, on February 27th, which is approximately a lunar month after this date, we have a heightened sense of emergency in the consciousness, so much so that the stock market dropped 1,200 points. When the moon is in the sign of, I call it the firefighter sign, fight or flight sign, the adrenaline sign of Aries, people get fired up. People are fired up today, and the World Health Organization made its first declaration of a public health, and there's that word, emergency, when the moon was in the sign of Aries. I want to talk a little bit more about the moon in Aries. The moon in Aries has been going over Chiron and Black Moon Lilith in the first couple of months of the year. Will continue to do so. Understand that Chiron represents, is a symbol representation of health. Chiron, depicted right here at 2 degrees, is the wounded healer. Chiron represents approaching any sort of health situation, personally or in the world, with consideration and care, understanding that there is always a solution to any crisis. So we have the moon and Black Moon Lilith together in the sky when this announcement was taking place. And it's a similar type of energy on the 27th when I'm talking with you. So I think that's rather interesting, right? So this was the beginning of the clarion call on January 30th. Will it become a pandemic? Now, again, you could do your own research on this. A pandemic is a very specific type of health and disease emergency. There's criteria. It has to have the fact that a disease has caused illness, including illness resulting in death, and there's criteria, and there's a proportion to number of people having contracted a disease in proportion to how many deaths, and there's formulas with this. But really a pandemic is determined about how the disease is being distributed throughout the world. So as it's becoming more and more prevalent as we speak, and as the community spread is detected in more and more countries, the world moves closer towards meeting the third criteria, which is the worldwide spread. And here's the nuance here, the word new, a new virus. All right, so we've talked about 2020. We've got Saturn and Pluto, death and fear together in the sky. But we don't have Neptune forming a negative aspect as of yet. It's actually rather positive. However, my friends, the pandemic, above all pandemics, was the Spanish flu in 1917. Now, of course, that was so many light years ago and in consciousness, and we know it's a whole different day. And some very, this is again from the CDC. At that time, there were no antibiotics. So it's not just the flu that can create death, but it's the secondary infections, the bacterial infections that can create and cause death. There was at that time not really widespread good personal hygiene, and it was a different day and age. However, the astrology chart is very, very specifically pointing to the horrors of that time, which I'll get to in just a moment. Again, you can read this yourself. There were almost 500 million people infected, 1/3 of the world's population. And the number of deaths were estimated at the high side to be 50 million worldwide. Okay, so this devastating event in history, and it ebbed and flowed. This is just a particular chart when it was really growing in its veracity in September of 1917. So the operative aspect in astrology that just jumps out was the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the sign of Leo. So Saturn, again, is our limitation, the Hermit card, grumpy old man, gravitas, gravity, and fear. And it was next to Neptune, which is nebulousness and viruses and illusion and fantasy and escapism. Together in Leo was very significant. Here, we also have Dr. Death, Pluto, not lined up with those two planets, but on the south node. Remember, south node represents the negative or shadow side of that sign. The negative or shadow side of Cancer, where Pluto was at that time, is emotionally out of control, lack of family, lack of support, and again, fear, fear, and more fear. Now, what's really interesting, this worst case scenario, the nodes were opposite to where the nodes are today. I want you to really reflect on that. When the nodes were in Cancer, Capricorn in 1917 rather, that was in a reversed order than they have been since 2018, because the nodes represent consciousness. The nodes in Cancer, Capricorn represents a juggling act between feeling secure and feeling safe in both the world outside and the world of home. Cancer and Capricorn are signs that traditionally represent mother and father. How am I being nurtured? How am I feeding myself? How am I feeding others? And who is in control? Who is my boss? Am I the boss, or am I the victim of whoever is in control in my world? The other thing about this, the Spanish influenza, we had Chiron and Pisces in conjunct Neptune and the Saturn conjunction. Let me show you where Chiron is. You can see the line here. So there's Chiron at 28 degrees of Pisces. It was making an inconjunct to our Leo dual. Now, in medical astrology, inconjuncts or 150-degree angles are often characterized or characteristic of health issues or health concerns, because an inconjunct means irreconcilable differences. The two planets are not making connections at all. They're like out of order. It's as if when you're driving and you're looking for your blind spot, you can't find a straight arrow of visual acuity. So inconjuncts equal health issues. So that was going on back then. And again, not so much now. Okay, so Leo was the big drama, larger than life. Saturn and Neptune together, conjunction, illusion, death, back in the Spanish flu era. Let's jump to 1956. This is another very important pandemic. Pluto was conjunct Jupiter in Leo. Pluto, death, was conjunct expansive Jupiter. So a lot of expansion. This doesn't just necessarily be limited to, of course, a pandemic, but people who were born in 1956 would have that Pluto-Jupiter conjunction. And here it is in the chart at 27 degrees, the same degrees. And the Asian flu, by the way, it had pretty much a short run. It was about a year and a half, 2 years, but it was considered by the World Health Organization as a Cat 2 pandemic. The categories of the World Health Organization came about, I think, in 2007, when they started categorizing pandemics like they would with hurricanes, with certain criteria. 2 million people died in this time frame. The nodes were in Gemini and Sagittarius, not where they are at now. And Saturn, but here's the other qualifying characteristics. Saturn, limitation and fear, was on the North node. All right, there it is in Sagittarius. So again, this was a very significant time of flu, but they say, World Health Organization said that part of the strain mutated, which developed over little over 10 years later in the Hong Kong flu in 1968. Now, this was a perfect storm. Now, this was also considered to be a Cat 2. It killed 1 million people worldwide. But I say perfect storm because we had inconjuncts. Remember, inconjuncts represent medical inconsistencies within our charts. And here's the inconjunct. Saturn, limitation and fear, inconjunct Dr. Death, Pluto, and inconjunct Neptune, which represents viruses and germs. So it was a perfect storm with this mutation. And I just wanted to throw that out to you, that this particular time frame had this horrific type of aspect. The one prior had something else, but not the other. The Spanish flu had everything. Okay, swine flu. Some of us might remember this one. The swine flu occurred in 2009. At that time, Leo again, Leo means drama, and we're in the nodes, the Leo Aquarius axis. And then we had Chiron, Neptune, and Jupiter involved. It was a very heady time, 2009. People were really muscling their awareness of humanity, not necessarily limited to the swine flu, but just in general. People were really believing, this is, again, we're really reaching out the World Wide Web. 2009 was an amazing time. We had Pluto on the side of Capricorn. There's a lot of adjustments being made in the world stage and creating the sentiment of hope, because so many of the planets were in Aquarius, including Chiron, Jupiter, and Neptune in Aquarius. Aquarius is synonymous with humanity. All right, so the swine flu occurred when Neptune, which means germs and viruses, was in the sign of the world of humanity. Okay. Now this is interesting. I think this gives us a little hope for our present predicament. The swine flu of 2008 and 2009, it really began to taper off. It was a pandemic by November of 2009. And by May of 2010, the number of cases were in steep decline. This is right from the CDC. On August 10th, the Director General of the World Health Organization announced the end of the H1N1 pandemic. And here's the chart. And I was so excited to see this because this is relevant to what's going to be taking place in a couple of weeks here on our cosmos, the planet in 2020. What happened when she made this announcement, it was within literally a day when the nodes changed signs, when they changed signs. And so I think that's very, very important to make a point of. It's like the crisis was over when the nodal shift occurred. So what to do during a pandemic? And I got to get this again from the CDC. And there's 4 major points for all of us: isolation, quarantine, dismissing school classes, changing work schedules. I thought, my goodness, each one of these aspects are very Saturnian, right? Changing your work schedule, changing your time, manipulating time and work in order to keep yourself isolated. Because remember that Hermit card, Saturn is about isolation and being one's own private, in one's own private counsel. So back to today. well, this is actually not today's chart, but this is the beginning this week of the plunge on the stock market. Financial effects, what's happening this week? We have Mercury retrograde, but here we go back to the nodal promise. When we have planets, especially Mars, Saturn, in the other cases, and Jupiter on the south node, it triggers out the shadow of that particular nodal direction. So the shadow of Capricorn is fear, and fear of structure, and fear that our structures are not taking care of us. This started our week out. February 25th, the markets began to plunge. Mars was right on top of the south node. Then we had Mars trine Uranus, quick change. I mean, in just one short week, this epidemic, so epidemic is on everyone's mind. We also have Venus, which is the money sign, the money planet, opposite to Juno, which represents partnerships. And that's at 20 degrees of cardinal, which was exactly squaring that lineup back in January. So there's a readjustment, fear factor concerning money and concerning partnering with money, which of course is the tool of the stock market. So going forward, our next step, and this is a very critical one, is the full moon that takes place on March 9th. It's an important full moon step because the sun will be conjunct Neptune. Remember, Neptune represents viruses. The full moon gives us illumination. Also, this is the day after Mercury goes direct. Right now, there's a lot of speculation, supposition, confusion, and fear out there. But by the time we get to March 9th and the full moon, things should calm down. We should be having more of a plan. And Uranus will be conjuncting Venus. I think the markets will still be going haywire at this point. And, but at least we'll have some more clarity. Perhaps they might actually announce that it's going to become a pandemic based on the criteria. That's on March 9th. Looking ahead, however, let's give you a little hope. Saturn makes its ingress in 2020 on March 24th. And what is this about? Remember, grumpy old man Saturn, the fear factor, isolation, Saturn that's been involved with all these other previous pandemics, changes signs on March 24th. So I think that might be lessening the crisis situation with this concern. However, it does go back into Capricorn on July 1st and stays in Capricorn until December. So there might be two stages or two phases of this outbreak. I'm calling it outbreak, it's not a pandemic yet. And at this point, I think there might have some more controls. This might be disrupting or a new order of things with our daily living. If we have to have more isolation or we have to be more considered with travel and so forth, this would be the time. So this also gives us a little hope, just like in the swine flu of 2009, when the nodes shift, that could herald more of a containment where this outbreak is losing some of its veracity. This takes place, the nodes change on June 4th, June 5th, depends on where you live in the world. So this would herald a more of a containment and control. The nodes will get out of fear and uncertainty of Cancer, Capricorn, and we'll be going into Gemini and Sagittarius. So this is a big day. Here's the chart. It's also an eclipse. And I think things will have another layer of release and relief. At the same time, our markets may not be totally in recovery yet because Venus will be in retrograde. So we still may be moving towards gaining the losses that are taking place now during the height, beginning height of the fear. Okay, so the perfect storm for a pandemic. The nodes might be in Cancer and Capricorn, just like they were back in the Spanish flu of 1917. Yads between Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto, And specific hard aspects with all, even going back to the Black Plague, we would have specific hard astrological aspects between Neptune and Saturn. And also the Leo element. I mean, how Leo is about vitality and life. And when we're dealing with something that can challenge our sun, our life, our light in a matter of minutes and hours and days, I would say Leo is also an element with the pandemic history. So coming to you from somewhere in the universe and hoping that you stay well and keep the faith no matter what. This is Cassandra Joan Butler. Thanks for listening.